October 26th, Black Tuesday, is going to become the greatest stock market crash, and then eventually the trade crash.
You have a great birthday, man.
Throughout the early 1900s, after Plessy versus Ferguson, a lot of people, the African American population, are going to move into cities. They're going to move in the northern states, primarily Chicago, Philadelphia, Boston, Erie, New York City. Erie, yes. Remember, at this time, Erie is a big port lake city, making a lot of lake and ocean vessels. Trains are still a big part of the economy in this area as well. And with the Harlem Renaissance, really the second generation of people after slavery, now kind of landing on their feet for the first time, and they're going to come up with their own kind of culture here. Now the Harlem Renaissance is not a renaissance in the sense of like going back to their traditional African roots. That'll be in the 1960s, 1970s. This is the African American population kind of finding their own American ways. And what's really kind of weird is the United States is the only country of Western society, Europe, Canada, etc., okay, that is a country with borders that does not have one solidified culture. Okay? If you think about it, we've got 1,000 different cultures really kind of within ourselves. And basically, African Americans are going to have the first time to really have their own. So some of the major aspects of this time period, again, a lot of this is kind of going back to Great Gatsby, if you know any of that, okay, is they're going to be working on literature, poetry. What's the most famous form of music that comes out of this Renaissance? Jazz and blues? Okay, good. So with this, you basically have different literary works come out of this, poetry. Most famous musicians of the era, Louis Armstrong, Ella Fitzgerald. They're coming out of New York. Langston Hughes is the great author of the era. Most famous African American athlete of the era is Joe Louis, who becomes the world champion boxer. Remember, this is back when boxing was real. Boxing as a sport now is dead. Does anyone know why? There was one specific event that happened in 1997 that ruined our version of boxing forever, and honestly, they need to restart the sport.
Rocky V.
That would be the 1980s, but I agree with you. No.
Dude got a deer bit off.
What's that?
Dude
That was 95.
Oh.
Mike Tyson.
No, that was 94 actually. Yeah. Yeah, that was he was facing at the time the world champion Evander Holyfield. He bites off Holyfield's ear in a brace. Yeah.
Wait, someone got knocked out and died.
Nope. Someone actually retired as world champion. They don't know who it was. He was black. He's going to retire as the world champion, ruining boxing forever.
Why did that ruin?
Don't say it.
I'll
Don't
say
say
it in a
it.
second.
World champion.
No, look it up.
Alright.
World
I
champion.
feel like I should know.
World champion who retires. It's Barack Obama before
Big
president.
show, bro.
Huh?
Boxed, fought,
Big
became
show.
the world champion. Retired, then became
Yeah,
president.
bro, that ruined Monday Night
George,
SmackDown forever.
that makes things a lot more entertaining. Was that?
Was it George Foreman?
No, Foreman was in the 70s. And he basically
Is that
was
a grill?
the second best boxer.
He was a
of all
boxer
time.
before he started making
How's that
grills.
feel? That's why he had to make his stupid oven.
Grill, bro.
Joe Frazier was also in that era,
Yeah.
the 70s. But the Frazier actually became a world champion.
Wait, when was this?
Probably Manny Pacquiao.
1990s.
Yeah. I think it was.
I think it was
Yeah.
Terry Marsh.
Nope.
Edge
That's what happened. Alright, I'm gonna say it.
When,
We got
Carl
when Sim
Lopez.
defeated Beetle.
Lennox Lewis retired as the world champion of boxing. And what happened is this. There are 4 belts for every region, okay?
Yeah,
And
Conor
since the
McGregor.
20s, the world championship belts, okay, have always been a unified champion. They've had all 4. Since then, all the belts have been basically held by various people. Floyd Mayweather is essentially the current heavyweight champion of the world because he has 3 out of 4 belts. But the guy who has the 4th belt
Dead.
refuses to fight him.
Who is it?
I think it's Vitaly Klitschko of Russia.
Oh,
Yeah.
he's good.
Yeah. Oh, he's great. Yeah, he's really good. But basically, Vitaly Klitschko refuses to box Mayweather.
Why?
Because he knows
What's
he's gonna
that?
lose.
Why?
Because of the money. Because if he loses the belt, he can go get it back. He's afraid of facing Mayweather. But Mayweather's the only
Mayweather's
I would
officially
go
out of
that
retirement.
Mayweather's the only fighter right now in current boxing who has the ability to actually reunify the titles. But because of
Yeah, well,
pay
Conor
per view,
McGregor has 2 belts in MMA.
they'll
so-
never reunify them because you can always say you're watching a heavyweight championship match, even though it's not the unified title. Which that's why he's a big deal. That's why Muhammad Ali was seen as such a great fighter, was because he was a unified champion.
I feel like I can
Same thing with
win.
Tyson, right? Same thing with Frazier. That's what they did. Yeah, what they did was this. Guys, when Lewis retired, what they did was the number 1 contenders, they basically made a top 8. And they fought each other individually for the first belt. And then the plan was to basically have those guys fight each other to create a unified title. And they're still not unified. Now,
So he retired in '97.
I think so, yeah.
Why did he? Well, what did he do after that? He do anything else?
No, he basically got out of it, became a commentator.
They said he competed until 2003.
What, he retired in 03 then?
Yeah, probably.
Did Muhammad Ali and Will Chamberlain ever fight? They were supposed to.
No.
Have you ever seen that?
Yeah.
That's fine. Yeah, like we'll talk to all these guys.
I'm telling you, I would get in that ring. You would come out oh, you're just like knocked out.
He already is.
You will be breathing out of a straw.
Yes.
That was awesome.
And
He said,
Alright,
You do it for the money?
the most famous people in the Harlem Renaissance for jazz, Ella Fitzgerald, Louis Armstrong. I'd like to get this done. Blues and jazz and bluegrass were really the only genres of music in this time. There were military marches, but again, most people don't want to hear that on the radio. So really you have blues and jazz music on the radio, you'd have bluegrass, you would have soap operas that were sponsored by Ivory and Irish Spring Soap. That's why they're called soap operas. If you did not know, the ones that are still on TV, some of those have been running for now 90 years. And they were originally on the radio. And then they became TV shows. And the reason why they're called soap operas is because, believe it or not, those are all done in one take. They're done in front of a live audience, and they do the entire soap opera more or less 3 hours before it is viewed on TV. And if it doesn't go well, that's why they have reruns. Seriously. Yeah. And so basically they continue on. It used to be on the radio, and what they would do is basically have one mic in a room. Everyone had the script, and they basically just read their parts. And again, the reason why they're called soap operas is because they were sponsored by soap companies. Now we're on the radio.
It's so much easier to just read out the script by radio.
Oh yeah, right? Yeah. And the thing is, basically, you as the listener would imagine the thing unfolding in your mind.
My grandma said that they all of her
So, the heater and the radio. I don't know the
Oh, the shit. Yes.
I'm gonna get like 15 on 20.
Only the shadow.
I wasn't here that first day that we started this unit. How long ago? That's the only thing I've done. Is that when you skip, bro?
Yeah.
What's that? I like this kind of stuff. I like my job. Get a little scout.
Oh, you wanted to be a scout?
No. I said scout on. Marcus Garvey is going to try to unify the African American population. Yeah, get this down, all of it.
You literally said scouts on it. You said, oh yeah, you ever seen the movie?
No,
I don't know.
No, I said, did you want to be a scout? And then
I said, did you ever see Joel the Curve? And he said, what? And I said, did you ever see that? He said, what?
Cheer, cheer.
Marcus Garvey.
Yeah, this is a weird guy.
That's what you said?
Marcus Garvey wanted to create a country of African American people in Liberia. If you remember, Liberia was first bought by James Monroe in the 1820s. Abraham Lincoln proposed colonization during the American Civil War. Garvey wanted to do it, mainly so that way he could be the leader of Liberia. And so he's going to have all these speaking tours, radio broadcast shows, where he's trying to rally the African American population to go by ship and to travel to Liberia and create their own population. By this time, Booker T. Washington has passed away. W.E.B. Du Bois is still writing and trying to still promote the NAACP. So Garvey kind of comes out of nowhere, and he's kind of the forefather of the Black Power movement, basically kind of the separationist of the African American culture. Not very popular at all. I think 200 people actually join him, and then they come back within a couple months. It doesn't really go well. The thing is this, the physical reality of African American people going to West Africa and starting a country is not a good idea. Predominantly because A, they don't know the culture, they don't know the society of West Africa, and most importantly, what's the predominant religion in West Africa?
Muslim.
It's Islam, okay? Remember, Islam's the religion, Muslims are the person. We have. Anyways, so yeah, generally speaking, Christians in Islamic West Africa, it doesn't really go well for us, okay? And because of this, Garvey's plan never comes to fruition. But, what's that? No, he basically fails. What's that? It's the lighting. It's actually really hot.
No, he looks like it's really soft. We don't have a game, so no.
Some of the great feats of the 20s. Like to get this down. 1927, Charles Lindbergh is going to be the first person to fly across the Atlantic Ocean non-stop. It goes from New York City to Paris, France. It takes him 26 hours to go across the Atlantic. No, especially with those kind of planes. Well, that's what they do is they create his plane. The Spirit, was that? What they did was they actually put a third tank on it. Yeah. What's that? Spirit of St. Louis. Called Spirit of St. Louis. That's right. That's the whole reference, though. The Great Explorer that's really up is referencing it.
What's Kevin referencing?
What's that?
Kevin.
Probably the dodo birds of the Galapagos Islands. So, in the same time period, another great airplane pilot appears, Amelia Earhart. And Amelia Earhart becomes the first female to do the same thing in 1932. And then she becomes the first female to go from California to Paris. She becomes the first person to go from San Francisco to Egypt. And then in 1934, she goes and tries to be the first person to fly around the world and crashes somewhere in the Philippines and we don't know where she's at. So she's with Bigfoot maybe and Tupac, okay? We don't know where she's at, okay?
She's still alive.
What's that? Of course she is, sure. Yeah. I know. Mathematically now, she'd be classified as very dead. Yeah.
No.
Yeah.
How old is she? Or was she?
No,
She
where
would've
they
been
hide
like
those people, they have different
think she was
technology
on
that
the
keeps
Northeast
them alive
weekend.
forever.
Oh yeah, she's dead.
Sleep on the deck.
So you're saying she's got a chance? We had radio communication with her when she got into India. We had radio communication when she went over to China. Somewhere between the Philippines and Australia, we had this communication with her across the Pacific.
I'm out for 2 weekends, bro.
People have found various like parts of planes and everything. Ooh, the familiar airport, but we don't.
Yeah.
Maybe someday we'll figure it out.
Is Jesse gonna go with you guys?
I hope not.
Now, some of the biggest mistakes that we're gonna do in the 20s is we try to outlive what we had for our standards of living. And by doing that, one of the issues is credit. For the first time in our country's history, we have what we think of as credit. Credit cards do not become a thing until the 1980s. And so, prior to credit cards in the 1980s, what you did was, store by store, you could get store credit. So for instance, Ethan goes to Sears and he wants to buy a washer, but he can't afford it, okay? And so he goes up to the customer service and he opens up a line of credit at Sears, okay? And he gets the washer immediately and he pays it off $20 a month for blah, blah, blah many years, okay? Now, why do stores want that? Why do stores want you to do their store credit? Interest. Because instead of that $1,000 washer, I'm just gonna put a number, instead of a $1,000 washer, now that washer, because of the credit, and it's being paid on time, is now $1,300. That's why they want you to do this, is because they don't want you to pay it all off. So that way they make money off of the interest of that purchase. So they're making more money off of it, okay? This is why if you ever get credit cards, you don't keep a balance on them. You pay them off every month. If not, the companies eat you.
Yeah.
And the interest rate of most credit card companies is the legal limit, between 15 and 30%. Seriously. So be very, very careful about credit cards, because they will burn you in college. Luckily, I didn't own one until after college. Because I couldn't get some major mistakes.
Did you have a debit card?
Was that? Yeah, I had that. Remember, debit cards you don't get credit for. It's literally your bank account, right? So instead of you paying cash, you're not paying with that card.
Yes.
Like you're getting a
On my
check.
name.
Debit cards you pay about like you're getting a check card. Be careful.
125.
But also in the same breath, if you don't use any credit, you can't get any credit. It's kind of weird. Yeah, so my suggestion is this, if you want a good credit score when you get out of college, think about it. When you're getting loans, you're actually taking debt there. So my suggestion is to show that you can pay off debt well. Get a low balance credit card and just pay off your gas throughout college. That shows you can take like, you know, $90, $100 debt per month and you can pay it off easy. Another thing is like the government does not watch over the farmers nor the stock market. People are buying more than they can afford, and on top of that, most of the tax revenue and income from alcohol is all being given to illegal mobs and gangs, okay? Which is all pretty bad. Al Capone's making more money in a day than the president's making in a year, so that's not good. Yeah, Al Capone was making around 400 to 500K a day at his peak. Was in Chicago and Philadelphia. And more or less completely doing illegal alcohol. Yeah. Yes.
I'll do what you gotta do. And I'm screwed for my math quiz.
Oh, I'm failing that.
Wait, so is properties and logarithms on this or not?
Actually, I don't know. What are those? I don't even know. The where you have to do the plus. Like log something that's on there.
I math and chem, my 2 liters, so that's what I'm 2 months.
I'm driving every weekend. I'm serious. Do you want to tell me? James Smith?
All right, I want to show you a quick
Oh,
video
Ian?
and then
Yeah.
we're done.
He knows. Oh my gosh.
Bye, guys. Close your eyes up. Okay, guys, come on, close. Let's go, everyone.
Closed.
1920s. The 20s gave us jazz, movies, radio, making out in cars, illegal liquor, and the 20s also gave us prosperity, although not for everybody, and gangsters, and a consumer culture based on credit, and lots of prejudice against immigrants, and eventually the worst economic crisis the U.S. has ever seen.
Mr. Green, but what about Gatsby?
Yeah, I mean, from the past, it's true that Gatsby turned out all right in the end, but what preyed on Gatsby, what foul dust trailed in the wake of his dreams, did temporarily close out my interest in the abortive sorrows and short-winded elations of men. So there's the stereotypical view of the 1920s as the roaring 20s, a decade of exciting change and new cultural touchstones, as well as increased personal freedom and dancing. And it really was a time of increased wealth for some people. The quote of the decade has to go to our famously taciturn president from Massachusetts, Calvin Coolidge, who said, "The chief business of the American people is business." Jay-Z would later update this for the 21st century, noting, "I'm not a businessman, I'm a businessman." But anyway, during the 1920s, the government helped business grow like gangbusters, largely by not regulating it much at all. This is known as laissez-faire capitalism, or laissez-faire capitalism if you're good at speaking French. The Republican Party dominated politics in the 1920s, with all the presidents elected in the decade being staunch conservative Republicans. The federal government hewed to the policies favored by business lobbyists, including lower taxes on personal income and business profits, and efforts to weaken the power of unions. Presidents Harding, Coolidge, and Hoover stocked the boards of the Federal Reserve and the Federal Trade Commission with men who shared their pro-business views, shifting the country away from the economic regulation that had been favored by progressives. And that was very good for the American economy, at least in the short run. The 1920s were also marked by quite a bit of government corruption, most of which can be pinned to the administration of Warren G. Harding. Now, Harding himself wasn't terribly corrupt, but he picked terrible friends. They included Attorney General Harry Doherty, who accepted money to not prosecute criminals, and Interior Secretary Albert Fall, who took $500,000 from private business in exchange for leases to government oil reserves at Teapot Dome. Fall later became the first cabinet member ever to be convicted of a felony. But on the other hand, business, man! Productivity rose dramatically, largely because older industries adopted Henry Ford's assembly line techniques, and newer industries like aviation, chemicals, and electronics grew up to provide Americans with new products and new jobs. During the 1920s, annual production of cars tripled to 4.8 million, and automobile companies were gradually consolidated into the big three that we know today: Ford, Chrysler, and Harley-Davidson. What? General Motors. By 1929, half of all American families owned a car, and thus began the American love affair with the automobile, which is also where love affairs were often consummated, which is why in the 1920s cars came to be known as schoolly-pooping chariots. What's that? They were called brothels on wheels. And the economy also grew because American corporations were extending their reach overseas, and American foreign investment was greater than that of any other country. The dollar replaced the pound as the most important currency for trade, and by the end of the decade, America was producing 85% of the world's cars and 40% of its overall manufactured goods. Stan, can I get a libertage? And companies churned out all kinds of labor-saving devices like vacuum cleaners, toasters, refrigerators, and not having to spend all day washing your clothes or turning over your own toast like some kind of commoner meant that Americans had more time for leisure. And this was provided by radios and baseball games, boxing matches, vacations, dance crazes. I mean, before Gangnam Style, there was the Lindy and the Charleston. But probably the most significant leisure product was movies, and I'm not just saying that because I'm staring into a camera. The American film industry moved out to Hollywood before World War I because land was cheap and plentiful. All that sunshine meant that you could shoot outside all year round, and it was close to everything. Desert, mountains, ocean, plastic surgeons. And by 1925, the American film industry had eclipsed all of its competitors and become the greatest in the world, especially if you count by volume and not quality. And more people had money to go see those movies thanks to consumer debt. The widespread use of credit and layaway buying plans meant that it was acceptable to go into debt to maintain what came to be seen as the American standard of living, and this was a huge change in attitude. These days we don't even think of credit cards as debt, really, but they are. And that was a relatively new idea, as was another feature of American life in the 20s that is still with us: celebrity. Opera singer Enrico Caruso has often been called the first modern celebrity, but now he's a lot less famous than Charlie Chaplin or Rudolph Valentino or Babe Ruth. But probably the biggest celebrity of the decade was Charles Lindbergh, whose claim to fame was flying across the Atlantic Ocean by himself without stopping, although he did use an airplane, which makes it slightly less impressive. Now, Lindbergh wasn't a truly contemporary celebrity in the sense of being famous for being famous, but he was a business more than a businessman. High culture also flourished. This was the age of the lost generation of American writers, many of whom lived and worked in Europe, but America had its own version of Paris in New York. The decade of the 1920s saw continued migration of African American people from the South to cities in the North, and Harlem became the capital of Black America. And speaking of migration, let us now migrate to the chair for the mystery document. The rules here are simple. I guess the author of the mystery document, I'm either right or I get shocked with the shock pen. All right, let's see what we got here. If we must die, let it not be like hogs hunted and penned in an inglorious spot, while round us bark the mad and hungry dogs, making their mock at our accursed lot. Like men will face the murderous, cowardly pack, pressed to the wall, dying, but fight back. Stan, thank you for the poetry. I appreciate that. It's not some obscure document from 18th century blah, blah, blah. It's Claude McKay, Harlem Renaissance poet. The poem is called If We Must Die. It's the only thing in the world I'm actually good at. Now, I know this from the imagery alone, especially the line about mad and hungry dogs that would figuratively and literally make up the mobs at the lynchings. But the giveaway here is the ultimate sentiment that we will fight back. This was part of the spirit of the Harlem Renaissance, which rejected stereotypes and prejudice and sought to celebrate African American experience. Meanwhile, things were changing for women as well, as they found new ways to express autonomy. Flappers kept their hair and skirts short, smoked and drank illegally in public, and availed themselves of birth control. And marketers encouraged them to buy products like cigarettes, christened Torches of Freedom by Edward Bernays. Liberation had its limits, though. Most women were still expected to marry, have children, and find their freedom at home through the use of washing machines. But the picture of prosperity is, as usual, more complicated than it at first appears. The fact that so many Americans were going into debt in order to pursue the American dream meant that if the economy faltered, and it did, there was going to be lots of trouble. Let's go to the thought bubble. Prosperity in the 1920s wasn't equally distributed through the population. Real industrial wages rose by a quarter between 1922 and 1929, but corporate profits rose at twice that rate. By 1929, 1% of the nation's banks controlled 50% of the nation's financial resources, and the wealthiest 5% of Americans' share of national income exceeded that of the bottom 60%. An estimated 40% of Americans lived in poverty. Now, many Americans celebrated big business, and Wall Street was often seen as heroic, possibly because by 1920, about 1.5 million Americans owned some kind of stock. But big business also meant that smaller businesses disappeared. During the 1920s, the number of manufacturing workers declined by 5%, the first time this class of workers had seen its numbers drop, but not the last. Now, some of these jobs were made up for by new jobs in retail, finance, and education, but as early as the 1920s, New England was beginning to see unemployment and deindustrialization as textile companies moved their operations to the South, where labor was cheaper. And working class people still made up the majority of Americans, and they often couldn't afford these newfangled devices. Like in 1930, 75% of American homes didn't have a washing machine, and only 40% of them had a radio. Farmers were even worse off. Many had prospered during World War I when the government subsidized farm prices in order to keep farms producing for the war effort. But when the subsidies ended, production didn't subside, largely due to mechanization and increased use of fertilizer. Farmers' incomes dropped steadily, and many saw banks foreclose upon their property. For the first time in American history, the number of farms declined during the 1920s. For farmers, the Great Depression began early. Thanks, Thought Bubble. So in general, the federal government did little to nothing to help farmers or workers. The Supreme Court was the only segment of the government that kept any progressive ideas alive, as they began to craft a system of ideas that we call the jurisprudence of civil liberties. Now, the court still voted to uphold convictions of left-wing critics of the government, but gradually began to embrace the idea that people had the right to express dissonant views in what Oliver Wendell Holmes called the marketplace of ideas. In Narr versus Minnesota, the Supreme Court struck down censorship of newspapers, and by 1927, Justice Brandeis was writing that freedom to think as you will and to speak as you think are indispensable to the discovery and spread of political truth. But despite increased free speech and torches of liberty and flappers and the Harlem Renaissance, the 1920s was in many ways a reactionary period in American history. For instance, the decade saw the resurgence of the Ku Klux Klan in a new and improved form, and by improved, I mean much more terrible. Spurred on by the hyper-patriotism that was fostered during World War I, the Klan denounced immigrants and Jews and Catholics as less than 100% American, and by the mid-20s, the Klan claimed more than 3 million members, and it was the largest private organization right here in my home state of Indiana. And with more immigrants coming from Southern and Eastern Europe, who were often Catholic and Jewish, white Protestants became more and more concerned about losing their dominant position in the social order. Spoiler alert, it turns out okay for you white Protestants. The first immigration restriction bill was passed in 1921, limiting the number of immigrants from Europe to 357,000. In 1924, a new immigration law dropped that number to 150,000 and established quotas based on national origin. The numbers of immigrants allowed from Southern and Eastern Europe were drastically reduced, and Asians, except for Filipinos, were totally forbidden. The quota for Filipinos was set at 50 per year, although they were still allowed to emigrate to Hawaii because their labor was needed there. There were no restrictions, however, on immigration from the Western Hemisphere because California's large-scale farms were dependent on seasonal laborers from Mexico. These immigration restrictions were also influenced by fear of radical anarchists and pseudoscientific ideas about race. Whites were seen as scientifically superior to people of color, and as President Coolidge himself declared when he signed the 1924 immigration law, America must be kept American. Tell me, Calvin Coolidge, about how American you are. Are you Cherokee, or Cree, or Lakota? The 1920s also saw increased tension between science education in the United States and religious beliefs. The best known example is, of course, the trial of John Scopes in Tennessee in 1925. Scopes was tried for breaking the law against teaching evolution, which he had been encouraged to do by the ACLU as a test case for freedom of speech. Scopes was prosecuted by William Jennings Bryan, whom you will remember as having recently resigned as Secretary of State, and who had become a leader of the fundamentalist movement. And Scopes was defended by Clarence Darrow, that famous defense attorney who contemporary defense attorneys always point to argue that defense attorneys aren't all scum. Scopes and Darrow actually lost the trial, but the case drew national attention and ultimately led to evolution being taught in more American schools. The Scopes trial is often seen as a victory for free thinking and science and modernism, and I suppose it was, but for me, it's more a symbol of the contradictions of the 1920s. This is the decade that gave us mass consumer culture and celebrity worship, which are important and very complicated legacies, but it also saw the birth of modern conceptions of civil liberties. It was a period when tolerance became an important value, but at the same time, it saw a rise in lynchings. Immigrants were necessary for the economic boom of the 1920s, but at the same time, their numbers were restricted as they were seen as a threat to traditional American values. And that raises a question that we're still struggling with today. What are those values? I don't mean that rhetorically. Let me know in comments. Thanks for watching. I'll see you next week. Crash Course is produced and directed.
Hi guys, 5 minutes yours. Blowing up.
Oh,
Blowing up.